It began like many congressional hearings do, a packed room, papers rustling, and the subtle tension that fills the air whenever two strong voices are seated across from each other. Representative Lori Chavez-DeRemer had been waiting for her turn to speak. When she finally got it, she leaned forward with that confident look politicians wear when they've rehearsed their line more than once. Her focus was squarely on Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic representative from Texas. Known for her bold speaking style and her unwillingness to back down when challenged, Lori Chavez started off by praising the committee's work and then smoothly pivoted into a sharp critique aimed directly at Crockett. Her tone carried that faint mix of politeness and provocation, the kind that sounds respectful on the surface, but is meant to sting underneath. She accused Jasmine of being more interested in showmanship than substance. The words echoed slightly, enough to make a few people in the room glance up from their notes. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in a little closer, as if they too sensed something was about to happen. Chavez-DeRemer's comment wasn't random. It had been building for weeks, maybe months. In past sessions, Jasmine Crockett had earned attention for her fiery but well-informed speeches, often going viral online, which, for some of her colleagues, was both impressive and irritating. Crockett's sharp questioning style, her colorful expressions, and her clear frustration with political double standards made her a standout figure in Congress. But for some, that visibility became easy ammunition. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, a Republican representative from Oregon, had likely seen those viral clips and decided this was the perfect opportunity to frame Crockett as someone chasing headlines rather than doing the hard, quiet work of policymaking. So when she dropped that accusation, showmanship over substance, it wasn't just an insult. It was a political strategy. It implied that Crockett's passion was an act, that her words were performance rather than conviction. Lori didn't raise her voice, didn't sneer. She just let the words hang in the air like a challenge. It was calculated.com and delivered with the kind of tone that says, "I'm being reasonable, why aren't you?" The reaction was subtle but telling. A few members of the committee nodded quietly, others shifted in their seats, and the press gallery began typing a little faster. For a moment, it looked like Chavez-DeRemer had managed to put Crockett on the defensive, but Jasmine just sat there, still and composed, listening. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes or fire back. She simply waited, and that silence, that stillness, said more than any immediate comeback could. Lori, perhaps thinking her point had landed, went on to contrast what she called real legislative work with attention-grabbing speeches. She cited the long hours her staff spent drafting bills, the bipartisan meetings she attended, and the importance of keeping discussions grounded. All of it seemed directed toward building the case that Crockett was focused on visibility rather than impact. The audience could tell this wasn't about one issue. It was about credibility. But here's the thing about Jasmine Crockett. She's a trial lawyer by background. She knows how to listen to an argument, find its weakest point, and respond with precision. Every word Lori Chavez-DeRemer spoke was quietly being filed away, analyzed, and reframed in Jasmine's mind. The accusation may have sounded powerful, but Crockett understood what was really being said, and more importantly, what wasn't being said. To Lori, the phrase showmanship might have sounded like a harmless jab, a comment about style over substance. But to Jasmine, and to many who have faced similar criticisms, it carried an old undertone, one that questioned the legitimacy of passion, of speaking boldly, of refusing to stay quiet in a space that often rewards conformity. Crockett had been called too loud, too emotional, too outspoken before. Yet every time she had met those labels not with anger but with evidence, the kind that speaks louder than any soundbite. So as Chavez-DeRemer's remarks came to an end, the air felt thick with expectation. Everyone in that room knew Jasmine Crockett wouldn't let it slide, but no one could predict what would follow. The cameras stayed fixed on her as she adjusted her mic. Lori looked briefly satisfied, certain she had scored a point. What she didn't realize, though, was that her 90-second critique had just set the stage for one of the most controlled and concise rebuttals of the entire session, one that would take Jasmine Crockett less than a minute to deliver, but long enough to leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice or show any sign of irritation. She didn't rush to respond to Lori Chavez-DeRemer's accusation or attempt to match her in tone. Instead, she took a measured breath, adjusted her microphone, and began speaking with calm assurance. It wasn't the kind of response meant for applause or television moments. It was deliberate, clear, and deeply grounded. The room quieted almost instantly, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried it naturally. Her first words caught everyone off guard. "If by showmanship," she began, her voice even and steady, "you mean standing up for people who've been ignored? Then I'll take that as a compliment." The statement wasn't defensive, and it wasn't angry. It was the kind of response that flips a criticism into a declaration of purpose. Lori Chavez-DeRemer blinked, momentarily unsure whether Crockett had just agreed with her or refuted her. That was the brilliance of Jasmine's tone. It was disarming. As she continued, Crockett's words built quietly in strength. Substance isn't about how quiet we stay. It's about what we fight for and who we fight for when no one's watching. That line seemed to hang in the air for a moment, reverberating with a truth that transcended party lines. Some of the committee members leaned back. A few even nodded subtly. It wasn't showmanship at all. It was clarity. Something rare in a room often filled with political theater. Asterisk for Jasmine. That 42-second response wasn't rehearsed. It came from experience. She knew what it meant to be underestimated and misrepresented. Before entering Congress, she had spent years as a public defender and civil rights attorney in Texas. She had seen firsthand what substance really meant, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. So when Lori Chavez-DeRemer tried to dismiss her as a performer, Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was defending a way of doing politics that doesn't fit neatly into the traditional mold. Asterisk. Her choice of words was subtle but powerful. She didn't accuse Lori of bad faith. She didn't turn the moment into a partisan battle. Instead, she reframed the accusation in moral terms. She made showmanship sound like advocacy and substance sound like empathy in action. In doing so, she exposed the hollowness of the original charge without ever sounding combative. Asterisk. Lori Chavez-DeRemer tried to interject, shifting in her seat as if preparing a follow-up, but Crockett wasn't finished. In those remaining seconds, she spoke about the importance of visibility, how speaking out publicly can inspire people who feel unseen. She mentioned how her own constituents often tell her that when she speaks up in those hearings, they feel represented in rooms they've never been invited into. That, she said, was why she spoke with energy and passion, not for herself, but for those who couldn't be there to speak for themselves. Asterisk. It was in that moment that the tone of the entire exchange changed. What began as a personal jab became a broader reflection on what leadership looks like in the modern era. Lori Chavez-DeRemer had hoped to frame Jasmine Crockett as a politician who talks more than she acts. But Crockett's answer revealed something deeper, that sometimes the act of speaking boldly is the work. Asterisk. The audience could sense the shift. You could hear a few faint murmurs, the quiet rustle of notes being put down as listeners absorbed what had just been said. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the composure and precision of her response. There was no shouting match, no exchange of insults, just a sharp, thoughtful rebuttal that hit its target cleanly. Asterisk. Crockett's ability to stay composed wasn't accidental. It came from her understanding of how perception works in high-stakes political spaces. She knew that any sign of anger would feed into the very narrative Chavez-DeRemer had tried to construct. Instead, she turned restraint into power. Each sentence was crafted to show not just intelligence, but purpose. By the time she finished speaking, it was clear that she had taken control of the room, not by overpowering it, but by grounding it in truth. Asterisk. Lori Chavez-DeRemer sat back, papers in hand, expression unreadable. She seemed to be searching for a line of response, something that could undo the effect of what had just happened. But there wasn't much to say. Jasmine Crockett's 42 seconds had reframed the entire conversation, leaving no room for counter-argument. Asterisk. What made it so remarkable wasn't just the speed or brevity of her answer. It was the depth packed into those few moments. In less than a minute, Jasmine Crockett managed to turn an accusation into an affirmation. She showed that composure could be stronger than confrontation, and that sometimes the most impactful rebuttals don't come from volume, but from conviction. Asterisk. In the end, she didn't just defend herself. She demonstrated why she didn't need to. After Jasmine Crockett's initial response left the room in silence, she didn't stop there. Her words had already redefined the moment, but she knew that clarity required more than eloquence. It needed proof. And that's exactly what she provided. Without raising her voice, she shifted seamlessly from addressing the accusation to outlining her actual record. What followed wasn't emotional or defensive. It was methodical. Crockett began listing the legislation she had helped shape, the initiatives she had supported, and the results that followed. Asterisk. Her tone stayed calm, deliberate, and anchored in facts. Let me be clear, she said, turning slightly toward Lori Chavez-DeRemer. My record speaks louder than any label. Then she began to enumerate her recent work. She spoke of her contributions to housing reform, ensuring better federal support for renters and first-time homebuyers, especially in communities hit hardest by rising costs. She mentioned her advocacy for small business protections, explaining how she'd worked across the aisle to help local entrepreneurs access federal funding during economic downturns. Asterisk. Lori Chavez-DeRemer watched closely, her earlier confidence softening slightly. She hadn't expected Crockett to come prepared with specifics, let alone deliver them with such control. The accusation of showmanship had implied that Jasmine was more focused on performance than policy. But in that moment, Crockett was doing the opposite of performing. She was teaching, laying out the quiet, unglamorous side of governance that rarely makes headlines. Asterisk. Jasmine's background as a civil rights attorney had always shaped how she approached politics. To her, laws weren't abstract debates. They were tools that affected real lives. As she listed her policy achievements, she made a point to connect them to the people behind them. When we talk about substance, she said, It's not about how often we're seen in this room. It's about whether families can pay rent, whether small businesses can stay open, whether justice is more than just a word. Asterisk, that line resonated. Even those who might not have agreed with her politically couldn't help but acknowledge that precision with which she framed her points. It wasn't grandstanding. It was grounded in the reality of governance. The type that doesn't get applause but builds trust quietly over time. Asterisk. Lori Chavez-DeRemer tried to maintain her composure, but there was no denying the shift in tone. Her earlier criticism now seemed to float in contrast to the evidence Jasmine had just laid out. Crockett had effectively turned the spotlight away from personality and back to substance, the very thing she was accused of lacking. What made it even more striking was how natural it seemed for her. There was no bitterness, no trace of self-praise. It was just facts, spoken plainly, leaving little room for interpretation. Asterisk, Crockett continued, highlighting her efforts in education and criminal justice reform. She explained how her team had worked with local school districts to expand access to early childhood programs, and how she had collaborated with other lawmakers to ensure fairer treatment in sentencing and policing. Each example was specific, each one tied back to results. And in doing so, she exposed a larger truth about the political accusation itself, that often, those who are most visible are also the ones doing the most work. Asterisk, her rhythm was unheard, but her points landed with steady precision. Every statement built upon the last, until it became clear that Lori Chavez-DeRemer's accusation was built on perception, not fact. Crockett's entire rebuttal showed that substance and communication were not opposites. They were partners. The ability to explain, to reach people, to inspire engagement, was not showmanship. It was part of what it meant to represent others effectively. Asterisk, as she spoke. Some members in the room quietly nodded, their expressions softening from skepticism to respect. A few even exchanged glances that seemed to say, she handled that well. It wasn't about politics at that point. It was about presence, the kind that earns attention without asking for it. Asterisk, Lori Chavez-DeRemer remained silent, flipping through her notes, perhaps realizing that pushing further would only emphasize how thoroughly Crockett had handled the exchange. The contrast between them was striking. Lori had entered the moment with a calculated critique, confident that she could corner Jasmine into defending her image. Instead, Jasmine used that very challenge as a platform to present her accomplishments with grace and precision. Asterisk. The power of her rebuttal wasn't in volume or speed, it was in restraint. Every fact she shared carried weight because it was grounded in lived experience and legislative reality. She spoke of meetings with community leaders, late-night calls with staffers, and the tedious process of turning ideas into laws. None of it sounded glamorous, but that was the point. It was the kind of substance that didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, provable and visible to anyone willing to look. Asterisk, by the time she finished, Jasmine Crockett had done more than defend herself. She had demonstrated, in real time, what authentic leadership looks like. Each example she cited turned the conversation from accusation to affirmation. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who had once framed the debate in terms of image, now sat facing someone whose quiet authority made image irrelevant. In just a few carefully chosen sentences, Crockett had transformed criticism into confirmation of her purpose, leaving no doubt about where the real substance. When Jasmine Crockett finished her measured and factual response, the entire energy in the committee room seemed to shift. For a few moments, there was a silence that didn't feel awkward. It felt heavy with realization. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who had begun the exchange with a sharp and confident tone, now sat quietly, flipping through her papers as if looking for something to say next. But there was nothing left to add. Jasmine's 42-second response had dismantled the accusation so completely that any follow-up would have sounded forced. The strength of her words didn't come from emotion or volume. It came from precision and timing. Asterisk, the members of the committee had seen heated exchanges before. Congress is full of interruptions, rebuttals, and the kind of noise that fills news cycles but doesn't leave a lasting impact. This moment was different. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't lectured. She had simply spoken with such composure that it left no room for argument. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who had entered the exchange expecting to expose what she thought was a weakness, ended up revealing something entirely different. That Jasmine Crockett's restraint was her power. Asterisk, there was something almost cinematic about how quietly the moment ended. A few lawmakers on both sides of the aisle exchanged brief glances. One or two smiled faintly, recognizing the rare instance when a rebuttal didn't feel rehearsed but genuine. Even those who disagreed with Crockett's politics could see that she had handled herself with the kind of professionalism that's impossible to fake. The tension that had filled the air earlier seemed to dissolve. Asterisk, Lori Chavez-DeRemer's body language said what her words couldn't. She leaned back in her chair, her earlier assertiveness replaced by a posture of reluctant acknowledgement. It wasn't humiliation, it was recognition. She had thrown a calculated accusation, and Jasmine had answered it with something more powerful than outrage: grace and evidence. Crockett didn't have to win through dominance, she won through steadiness. And in politics, that kind of win lingers longer. Asterisk what made Jasmine's response so effective was how it appealed to reason rather than reaction. She didn't just silence Lori Chavez-DeRemer, she silenced the assumptions behind the accusation, the idea that passion and seriousness couldn't coexist, that being outspoken meant being shallow, had been dismantled in less than a minute. By presenting her record, her principles, and her purpose with quiet conviction, she exposed how flawed the criticism truly was. Crockett leaned back slightly after finishing, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't glance toward the audience or the cameras. Her demeanor said everything. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to represent. That distinction was what made her words resonate. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who had tried to position herself as the voice of reason, now found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the one who looked flustered. As the committee chair called for the next speaker, the atmosphere remained subdued. The usual back-and-forth chatter didn't return immediately. People were still processing what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't dramatic or fiery, but it had weight. The kind of weight that comes from watching someone hold their ground without needing to fight for it. The irony was clear. Lori Chavez-DeRemer had accused Jasmine Crockett of focusing on showmanship over substance, but the exchange had proven the opposite. Crockett's restraint became her substance. Her clarity became her message. The accusation had been intended to undermine her credibility, but instead, it enhanced it. Even the press sitting in the back of the room seemed to pause longer than usual before typing again. This wasn't the kind of clip that went viral because of shouting or chaos. It was the kind that spread because of quiet confidence, the kind of moment that made people stop and think. Jasmine Crockett had managed to do, in less than a minute, what many politicians struggled to do in an entire speech. She commanded respect without demanding it. For Lori Chavez, it must have been a moment of uncomfortable reflection. She had walked into that hearing prepared to make a point about style versus substance, but Jasmine had shown that the two weren't opposites. They could exist together, harmoniously, when grounded in truth. Crockett's delivery had both style and substance, and that combination left her opponent without a foothold. As the discussion moved on, the tone of the room remained noticeably more measured. Even the next speakers seemed to tread carefully, aware that the atmosphere had changed. Jasmine didn't interrupt, didn't react further. She simply sat quietly, taking notes, occasionally nodding, the picture of calm authority. Lori, meanwhile, kept her gaze down for much of the remainder of the session. The power dynamics had shifted, but not in a way that anyone could dramatize. It wasn't about victory or defeat, it was about presence. Jasmine Crockett had shown that sometimes the strongest voice in the room isn't the loudest one. It's the one that speaks last, clearly, and with purpose. And in that hearing room, her composure did what arguments rarely do. It created silence, not from intimidation, but from undeniable respect. As the committee session drew to a close, the atmosphere in the room remained noticeably different from how it had started. What began as a sharp exchange had ended with a quiet, reflective calm. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to celebrate her moment. The strength of it spoke for itself. She gathered her notes, exchanged a few polite nods with nearby colleagues, and prepared to leave, her composure never once faltering. The cameras that had fixated on her during the exchange now followed her as she stood, capturing not a fiery confrontation, but a portrait of controlled authority. For Lori Chavez, the silence that followed her earlier accusation was telling. In politics, silence can mean a lot. Sometimes more than applause. It can mean agreement, surprise, or even respect. In this case, it was all three. What had been intended as a public rebuke of Crockett's style ended up becoming a moment of credibility for her instead. Lori's words had aimed to define Jasmine as a politician of flash and rhetoric. But Jasmine's poise and substance reshaped that narrative completely. What lingered wasn't just the memory of a rebuttal, it was the reminder of how truth carries its own quiet gravity. Crockett's answer worked because it didn't overreach. She didn't try to score points or turn the exchange into spectacle. She understood that sometimes the best argument is the one that ends with stillness, not applause. Her ability to remain centered, even under provocation, revealed the depth of her professionalism. It was a reminder that leadership isn't about how loudly one speaks, but how clearly one stands. As the hearing adjourned, members filed out, still murmuring about the exchange. Reporters tapped away on their laptops, already drafting headlines that would capture the essence of what had just unfolded. How a 42-second response managed to shift the tone of an entire hearing. Outside the chamber, a few aides and observers were overheard discussing how rare it was to witness such restraint in real time. In a political environment often dominated by spectacle and division, Crockett had shown that calm could still be powerful. Lori Chavez-DeRemer left the room soon after, her expression composed but noticeably subdued. She didn't make further remarks about the encounter, nor did she attempt to reframe it. Some of her staffers avoided eye contact with the press as they moved briskly through the corridor. It was clear the exchange hadn't gone as planned. But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about victory over an opponent. It was about demonstrating that integrity could cut through noise faster than confrontation ever could. Later that day, Clips of the exchange began circulating online. People shared her words not because they were dramatic, but because they were grounded. The calmness, the confidence, and the refusal to be baited became the talking point. Many viewers commented on how rare it was to see a politician handle criticism without deflecting or escalating. It wasn't just a political moment, it was a character moment. Jasmine Crockett had proven something fundamental, that composure is not weakness, and that conviction doesn't require volume. In an age where so many chase attention, she had quietly earned respect. Her 42-second response would be remembered not for its brevity, but for its impact, a masterclass in how truth, delivered calmly, can silence a room